Welcome to this peaceful hour of storytelling, where we step back through the centuries to visit a simpler time. Tonight, we will walk together through the lanes of a medieval village, watching as the seasons turn and ordinary life unfolds in gentle rhythms. There is no urgency here, no drama to disturb your rest. Only the steady passage of days, the patient work of hands, and the comfort of tradition passed down through generations. Let us begin our journey in the village of Millbrook. Nestled in a valley where a clear stream turns the great wooden wheel of the miller's house. The year is 1325, though such dates matter little to the people who live here. They mark time by harvests and holy days, by the first frost and the return of swallows in spring. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders settle, and allow yourself to drift back to this quieter world. The day begins long before sunrise in Millbrook. In the bakehouse near the village square, Thomas the baker is already at work. He has been awake since the church bells rang for matins, the midnight prayers, though he did not attend. His work is its own form of devotion, providing the daily bread that sustains his neighbors. Thomas moves slowly through the darkness, his hands finding tools and ingredients by memory rather than sight. The bakehouse is warm from the embers that have smoldered all night in the great oven. He adds wood carefully, listening to the crack and whisper of flames coming to life. There is no need to rush. The bread will rise at its own pace, following rhythms older than any living memory. His apprentice, young William, arrives as the first gray light touches the eastern sky. The boy is 14 summers old, learning the craft that his own sons might practice someday. Together, they work in comfortable silence, kneading the dough that was mixed and left to rest the evening before. The motion is rhythmic and soothing. Press forward with the heels of both hands, fold the dough back toward yourself, turn it a quarter way round, and begin again. Press, fold, turn. Press, fold, turn. The dough is made from rye flour, ground at the village mill just yesterday. It is darker and coarser than the wheat bread that the lord of the manor eats, but it is honest food, and it fills the belly. Thomas shapes the dough into round loaves, each one marked with a simple cross cut into the top with his knife. This mark serves two purposes. It allows steam to escape as the bread bakes, and it reminds all who eat that their sustenance comes from God's blessing. As the loaves rest before baking, Thomas tells William about the properties of different grains. Rye grows well even in poor soil and can withstand cold that would kill wheat. Barley makes a heavy, dense bread that keeps a man working through a long day in the fields. Oats are usually fed to horses, but in lean years, people make them into porridge or flat cakes. William listens carefully, knowing that someday this knowledge will be his livelihood. The village begins to wake around them. A rooster crows from someone's yard. A dog barks in the distance. The baker's cat, a gray mouser named Ash, stretches on the warm stones near the oven and begins to groom herself with methodical attention. These are the sounds of morning in Millbrook, unchanged for generations. When the oven reaches the proper heat, Thomas can judge this by holding his hand inside and counting slowly to 10. The loaves go in on long wooden paddles called peels. The oven door closes, and now there is nothing to do but wait. Thomas sits on a bench outside the bakehouse, watching the sky brighten and the village come fully to life. Across the lane, Marjorie the alewife is already stirring the mash for today's brewing. The blacksmith's hammer begins its steady ringing from the smithy at the edge of the village. A woman carries 2 wooden buckets on a yoke across her shoulders, heading toward the well. Children emerge from cottages, sent to gather eggs from the henhouse or fetch water or pull weeds from the vegetable gardens. This is the beginning of an ordinary day in Millbrook. Nothing remarkable will happen today. No great lords will pass through. No traveling merchants will arrive with exotic goods. No festivals or feast days mark this particular morning. It is simply another day of work and routine. The kind of day that makes up most of human life in any century. And there is deep comfort in this. ORDINARNESS. By the time the sun clears the eastern hills. Jeffrey, the miller, has been at work for 2 hours. The mill is the heartbeat of the village, and Jeffrey is its keeper. The great wooden water wheel turns constantly, day and night, as long as the stream flows with sufficient strength. The sound of it, a deep rhythmic creaking and splashing, is so constant that the villagers no longer hear it. Yet they would notice immediately if it stopped. Jeffrey is a man of perhaps 40 years, though he himself does not know his exact age. His hair and beard are perpetually dusted with flour, making him appear older than he is, as though he has been touched by an early frost. His clothes are simple, a long tunic of undyed wool, cross-gartered leggings, and a leather apron gray with flour dust. His hands are large and capable, marked with the calluses of his trade. The mill itself is a sturdy wooden building, 2 stories tall. The stream has been diverted to flow beneath it, turning the great wheel that powers the millstones above. Inside, the air is filled with the sweet, earthy smell of grain and the constant rumble of stone grinding against stone. Dust hangs in the shafts of sunlight that slant through the open windows. This morning, Jeffrey is grinding rye for Thomas the baker. The grain was brought yesterday by one of the manor servants, measured carefully, and recorded in the tally kept by the reeve. For his work, Jeffrey keeps a portion of the flour 1 measure in 12, as has been the custom since his grandfather's time. This is how millers make their living, taking a share of what they grind rather than being paid in coin, which few villagers possess anyway. The process is simple, but requires constant attention. Grain is poured into the hopper at the top of the millstones. It trickles down between the stones, which are turned by the power of the water wheel below. The upper stone remains still while the lower stone rotates, crushing the grain between them. The flour emerges at the edges and falls into a collecting bin, while the remaining bran and chaff are gathered separately. Jeffrey must monitor the distance between the stones carefully. Too close, and the flour will become hot from friction, potentially scorching and spoiling the flavor. Too far apart, and the grain will be crushed too coarsely. He adjusts its stones by turning a large wooden screw, working by feel and long experience rather than any precise measurement. His daughter, Eleanor, arrives as the morning brightens. She's 12 years old, a quiet girl with her father's steady disposition. She carries a basket containing their breakfast, bread from yesterday, cheese, and early apples from their small orchard. They eat together while the mill continues its work. Father and daughter sitting on the wooden stairs and watching the flour accumulate in the collecting bin. Eleanor asks her father to tell her again about the old mill, the one that stood here before this one was built. Jeffrey smiles and begins the familiar story. The old mill, he says, was smaller and cruder, with stones that had to be turned by hand when the stream ran low in summer. His grandfather had worked that mill, grinding grain by muscle and sweat when the water failed. This new mill, built when Jeffrey was just a boy, represents a great improvement. The stones are larger and better shaped. The gears are more precisely fitted. The water wheel is engineered to catch the current more efficiently. Every generation, Jeffrey tells his daughter, builds upon what came before. Your children will likely see an even better mill here, with improvements we cannot yet imagine. Eleanor listens contentedly. She has heard this story many times, but it comforts her like a familiar prayer. She knows that someday, perhaps, she will tell her own children about this mill, about her father's careful work, about the sound of the water wheel that has marked every day of her childhood. The morning passes in this steady rhythm. Farmers arrive with sacks of grain on their shoulders or in small handcarts. Jeffrey greets each by name, accepts their grain, and makes his marks in the tally book. He cannot read or write, but he has his own system of notches and symbols that record every transaction. The reeve can read these marks as easily as a scholar reads Latin. Between grinding sessions, Jeffrey performs the endless maintenance that keeps the mill functioning. He oils the wooden gears with rendered fat. He checks the leather belts for wear. He examines the millstones for cracks or unevenness. When stones become too worn, they must be dressed carved with new grooves by a skilled craftsman who travels from mill to mill throughout the region. Jeffrey can do minor dressing himself, using iron picks to recarve the shallow channels that help the flour move outward as it is ground on. The mill represents a considerable investment by the lord of the manor, who owns it and profits from it. But Jeffrey tends it as though it were his own, knowing that his livelihood and the village's well-being depend upon its continued operation. When he lies in bed at night in the small cottage beside the mill, he can hear the water wheel turning in the darkness. The sound is like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. On the rare occasions when the stream floods and the wheel must be stopped, or when ice clogs it in the deepest winter, the silence feels wrong, like holding one's breath. Beyond the village, the great open fields stretch toward the horizon in long strips of cultivated land. This is where most of Millbrook's people spend their days, bent to the earth, coaxing life from soil that their ancestors have worked for longer than anyone can remember. The fields are organized in a way that might seem strange to modern eyes, but which makes perfect sense to the villagers. Instead of each farmer working a single plot of land, the fields are divided into many narrow strips. Each family holds rights to multiple strips scattered throughout the 3 great fields that surround Millbrook. This year, the north field grows wheat and barley. The east field holds rye and oats. The south field lies fallow, resting and recovering its strength, scattered with the droppings of sheep and cattle that graze there. Next year, the crops will rotate. The north field will lie fallow. The east field will be planted with wheat and barley, and the south field will grow rye and oats. This pattern repeats endlessly, giving the soil time to recover, while ensuring that each family has some land in production every year. On this particular morning in late summer, the north field is alive with activity. The wheat is ready for harvest, its golden heads heavy with grain. The entire village has turned out for the work, for harvest time requires every able hand. Even children old enough to walk steadily are given simple tasks. John of the Oak, so called because he farms the strips nearest the ancient oak tree at the field's edge, is leading a team of workers down his longest strip. He swings his scythe in long, even strokes, cutting the wheat close to the ground. Behind him, his wife Alice and their 2 daughters gather the cut stalks into bundles, which they tie with twisted lengths of straw. His son Henry, though only 8 years old, follows behind, gleaning any fallen grains and placing them carefully in a sack. Nothing is wasted in harvest time. The work is hard and monotonous, but there is satisfaction in it. The weather has been kind this year. Enough rain in spring to make the seeds sprout, enough sun in summer to ripen the grain. The harvest will be good, meaning full bellies through the winter, and perhaps even a small surplus to trade for things the family cannot make themselves. Iron tools from the blacksmith, pottery from the potter who lives 3 villages away, or salt brought by traveling merchants from the distant coast as they work. The villagers talk quietly among themselves. Gossip flows up and down the rows like water finding its course. Someone's cow has gone dry earlier than expected. The Lord Steward has announced that extra labor will be required next month to repair the manor house roof. A traveling friar passed through last week and delivered a sermon in the church. Though half the congregation could not understand his Latin, young Edmund, the carter's son, has been making eyes at Rose, the swineherd's daughter. These conversations are punctuated by the rhythmic swish of scythes through grain and the occasional call for water. Several children have been assigned to carry stone jugs of weak ale from house to house and out to the fields. The workers drink gratefully, wipe their faces with rough sleeves, and bend again to their labor. The sun climbs higher. The day grows warm. Larks sing overhead, and butterflies dance among the wildflowers that grow at the edges of the field, where plowshares do not reach. Time is measured not by hours, but by the gradual movement of shadows and the completion of tasks. When John's strip is fully harvested, the team moves to the next strip, which belongs to his neighbor Robert. This mutual assistance is the foundation of village life. No family could complete their harvest alone in the brief window when the grain is perfectly ripe. So they work together, moving from strip to strip, helping each neighbor in turn. The system is not written down or formally organized. It is simply understood, a tradition as old as the village itself. By midday, the workers pause for their main meal. They gather in the shade of the ancient oak, unwrapping bundles of food brought from home. There is bread, naturally, for bread appears at every meal. There is cheese made from sheep's milk, hard and crumbly. There are onions and leeks from kitchen gardens. Some families have brought apples or pears from their few fruit trees. A lucky few have cold chicken or salted pork. The meal is not elaborate, but it is adequate, and the workers eat with the healthy appetite that comes from honest labor. They pass around jugs of ale, wiping their mouths and sighing with satisfaction. Children run about, playing games among the stacked grain sheaves. Young Edmund finds an excuse to sit near Rose, and the older adults smile knowingly at each other. After the meal comes a brief rest. Some workers lie back on the stubble, caps pulled over their eyes, and doze in the afternoon warmth. Others talk quietly or check their sides, sharpening the blades with whetstones carried in leather pouches. The landscape is peaceful under the late summer sun. Insects drone in the grass. A hawk circles lazily overhead, riding the warm air currents, but the rest does not last long. There is too much work, and the weather might change without warning. A sudden storm could flatten uncut grain or soak harvested sheaves, causing the grain to rot or sprout. So after perhaps half an hour, John of the Oak rises, stretches, and picks up his scythe again. The others follow his lead, returning to their patient labor. The afternoon passes like the morning, measured in strips of land gradually cleared. The sun begins its descent toward the western hills. The shadows grow longer. The temperature moderates, and the workers move a bit faster, knowing that sunset will end the day's labor. Finally, as the sun touches the horizon and the sky begins to flame with orange and pink, the day's work concludes. The last sheaves are tied and stacked. The tools are gathered. The workers stretch their aching backs and tired arms, taking a moment to survey what they have accomplished. The north field, which was golden and rippling with grain this morning, now shows long strips of pale stubble dotted with orderly stacks of harvested wheat. Tomorrow, the work will continue. The sheaves must be gathered and transported to the village. The grain must be threshed to separate the kernels from the chaff. It must be winnowed, allowing the wind to blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain falls back in the baskets. And then it must be taken to Jeffrey's mill to be ground into flour. But that is tomorrow's concern. Tonight, the workers walk slowly homeward through the gathering dusk, tired but content. The harvest is progressing well. The village will eat this winter. That is enough. In a workshop near the village green, Richard the carpenter is creating something that will outlast him. He works in wood, that most versatile of materials, shaping it with tools that are themselves works of craftsmanship. Richard is a relatively young man, perhaps 30 years old, but he has been learning his trade since he was 7. When his father first placed a small chisel in his hands and showed him how to pare away thin curls of wood. Now, 17 years later, his hands move with unconscious skill, reading the grain of the wood like a scholar reads text on. Today, he's working on a new chest for the church. The old priest, Father Benedict, commissioned this piece to store the altar cloths and other precious items used in the Mass. It will be made from oak, that strongest and most durable of English woods. Richard has been working on this chest for nearly 3 weeks, and it will take another week to complete. The workshop is an open-sided structure, allowing light and air to reach the work but providing shelter from rain. Wood shavings cover the floor in soft curls and spirals. The smell of fresh-cut oak fills the air, sweet and slightly sharp. Tools hang in careful order on the walls, saws of different sizes, planes, chisels, augers, mallets, measuring rods, and squares for ensuring right angles. Richard begins each day by sharpening his tools. A dull tool is dangerous. It requires too much force and can slip, causing injury. A sharp tool does the work almost by itself, guided by a steady hand. He uses whetstones of progressively finer grain, checking the edge by carefully running his thumb perpendicular to it. When the blade can catch and hold the whorls of his thumbprint, it is sharp enough that the chest is taking shape through patient accumulation of small actions. Richard has already cut and planed the bottom panel, the sides, the front, and the back. Each piece has been carefully measured and fitted. Medieval carpentry relies on joints rather than nails, which are expensive and hard to come by. So Richard creates elaborate interlocking joints, dovetails that hold corners together, mortises and tenons that connect rails and stiles, grooves that allow panels to float within their frames, expanding and contracting with changes in humidity without splitting. This morning, he's working on the lid. He has selected a beautiful piece of oak for this purpose, with dramatic grain patterns that will make the finished chest distinctive. Using a plane, he smooths the surface, working always in the direction of the grain. The plane makes a whispering sound as it peels away paper-thin shavings. Richard pauses frequently to run his hand over the surface, feeling for imperfections that are invisible to the eye. His apprentice, a boy named Martin, watches from the corner, where he is practicing cutting straight lines on a piece of scrap wood. Martin is 11 years old and will remain an apprentice for 7 years before he becomes a journeyman carpenter. He lives with Richard's family, sleeping in the loft above the workshop, eating at Richard's table, and learning the trade through observation and practice. "Why are you playing with the grain and not against it?" Richard asks without looking up. Martin recites the answer he has learned. Because planing against the grain tears the wood fibers, leaving a rough surface that cannot be smoothed. Planing with the grain cuts the fibers cleanly. "Good," Richard says. "And why do we use oak for this chest rather than pine or ash?" Oak is strong and resists rot. It will protect the contents of the chest for many years. Pine is softer and lighter, good for other purposes. Ash is flexible and good for tool handles. Richard nods, satisfied. The boy is learning. Someday, Martin will have his own workshop and his own apprentices. The craft passes from generation to generation this way, knowledge flowing like water from one vessel to another. As Richard works, villagers occasionally stop to watch or to speak with him about projects they need done. The blacksmith wife needs a new kneading trough. Her old one has cracked. The priest wants to know when the chest will be finished. A farmer asks about repairing a damaged cart wheel. Richard listens to each request, mentally noting what materials will be needed and when he might fit the work into his schedule. Unlike the farmers and laborers, Richard does not work for a wage or for shares of harvest. He's paid in kind. People give him grain, cheese, cloth, ale, or occasionally silver pennies for his work. The chest for the church will be paid for partly in coin from the collection box and partly in a promise that the priest will remember Richard's family in his prayers. This mixture of material and spiritual payment is typical of the age. By midday, The lid is smooth and ready for the next stage. Richard will need to cut the grooves that will allow the lid to slide in wooden channels, so it can be opened and closed smoothly. But this is delicate work that requires fresh concentration, so he decides to leave it for tomorrow morning when his mind and hands are at their sharpest dot instead. He turns to a simpler task, making wooden bowls. Every household needs bowls for eating, and they wear out or crack with regular use. Richard has a supply of bowl blanks, rough pieces of wood already shaped roughly into circular forms. He mounts one on a simple pole lathe, a device that allows him to spin the wood while shaping it with chisels. The pole lathe is powered by Richard's own foot. He presses down on a treadle, which pulls a cord wrapped around the wood, causing it to spin. When he releases the treadle, a springy pole mounted on the ceiling pulls the cord back, ready for another rotation. Richard cuts during the downward motion when the wood spins toward him, and lifts his chisel during the return stroke. The work is rhythmic and almost meditative. Press, cut, release. Press, cut, release. Wood shavings fly from the spinning bowl. The interior hollows out gradually. Richard's hands feel the thickness of the wood, keeping it even all around. Too thin, and the bowl will crack. Too thick, and it will be heavy and clumsy. Martin watches this process with fascination. The pole lathe is still too complex for him to operate, but Richard lets him try occasionally, standing behind the boy and guiding his hands. Feel the wood, Richard tells him. Listen to the sound the chisel makes. The wood will tell you what it wants to be. By late afternoon, Richard has completed 3 bowls. He sets them aside to dry slowly, away from direct heat that might cause them to crack. In a few days, he will smooth them with finer tools and perhaps rub them with oil to protect them from moisture. As the sun lowers, Richard begins the daily task of cleaning the workshop. Shavings and sawdust are swept into a pile. The larger pieces will be used for kindling. The finest sawdust will go to the butcher, who scatters it on his shop floor to absorb blood and make cleanup easier. Nothing is wasted. Tools are wiped clean and returned to their proper places. Richard teaches Martin that this is not mere tidiness, but essential practice. A tool left on the floor might be stepped on and damaged. A chisel left with wood resin on its blade will be harder to use tomorrow. We are caretakers of these tools, Richard explains. My father used some of them, and his father before him. Martin, you will use them after me, and perhaps your son after you. We maintain them not just for ourselves, but for those who come after. As twilight deepens, Richard and Martin walk together to the house where Richard lives with his wife, his 3 children, and now Martin as well. It is a comfortable home, better than most in the village, with a wooden floor rather than packed earth, shuttered windows, and a proper chimney rather than just a hole in the roof for smoke to escape. Richard's wife, Agnes, has prepared supper, a thick pottage of vegetables and barley, bread, cheese, and apples. The family gathers around the table, says a prayer of thanks, and eats together by the light of tallow candles and the hearth fire. The children tell their father about their day. The youngest, barely 3 years old, climbs into Richard's lap and falls asleep there, exhausted by the day's play. This is contentment, honest work. Sufficient food, a warm home, and family gathered together. Richard asks for nothing more. He will sleep well tonight, and tomorrow he will return to his workshop and to the chest that slowly takes shape under his hands. A thing of beauty and utility that will serve the church for generations to come. As summer fades into autumn, the character of village life shifts. The urgency of harvest gives way to the steady work of preparation for winter. The days grow shorter and cooler. Leaves begin to turn golden and russet. Morning mist lies heavy in the valleys. This is the season when the village takes stock of what it has accomplished and what it still needs to do before the cold months arrive. Roofs must be checked and repaired. Firewood must be cut, split, and stacked. Food must be preserved. Animals must be evaluated to decide which will be kept through winter and which must be slaughtered now. While their meat can feed families and be salted or smoked for later use in the forest that lies beyond the village fields, men are cutting wood. Some is needed for construction and repairs. The most will be burned to keep homes warm through the long winter. The right to take wood from the forest is carefully controlled by the Lord's forester, who marks certain trees for cutting and punishes anyone caught taking wood without permission. Walter the forester is a stern man who walks the woodland paths with a staff and a keen eye for signs of illicit cutting. But he is not unreasonable. He understands that people must heat their homes and cook their food. So he allows each household to collect fallen branches and dead wood, and he marks older trees that are past their prime for cutting. The forest must be maintained, not depleted, so it will continue to provide resources for future generations. The work of cutting and preparing firewood occupies many of the village men through the autumn weeks. They use axes and two-man saws to fell trees, then chop them into manageable sections. The wood is split with iron wedges and wooden mallets, creating pieces that will dry faster and burn more efficiently. The work is hard and sometimes dangerous. A falling tree or a misarmed axe can cause serious injury, but it is necessary that young boys accompany their fathers into the forest, learning to identify different trees by their bark and leaves, to judge which trees are dead or dying, to understand how weather affects wood quality. Oak and ash make the best firewood, burning hot and long. Pine burns faster and spits sparks, but it is easier to split. Birch bark is excellent for starting fires, peeling away in paper-thin layers that catch flame quickly. Meanwhile, in the village, women are engaged in their own preparations. The kitchen gardens must be harvested before frost kills the remaining crops. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, and onions are pulled from the earth, brushed clean, and stored in cool cellars where they will keep for months. Cabbages are cut and packed in brine to make sauerkraut. Apples are sliced and dried, strung on cords, and hung near the hearth. Pears are carefully wrapped and laid in straw. Alice, the wife of John of the Oak, spends her days preserving food with practiced efficiency. She has done this every autumn for the 20 years since her marriage. Her daughters work beside her, learning the skills they will need when they have households of their own. The work is repetitive, but not unpleasant. As they work, they talk, sharing news, discussing neighbors, planning for the winter ahead. The herbs that grew in Alice's small garden all summer are now being harvested and dried. Bundles of sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint hang from the rafters, filling the house with their fragrance. These herbs serve multiple purposes, flavoring food that will become monotonous by late winter, making medicinal teas for various ailments, and providing pleasant scents in a house that will be closed tight against winter cold. This is also the season when animals are slaughtered. Most families keep pigs, sheep, or goats, but fodder is scarce in winter. It makes no sense to feed animals through the cold months when they could instead become food now. So throughout the village, animals are selected for slaughter. It is done quickly and humanely by men experienced in the work. The slaughter days are busy ones. Nothing is wasted from the animals. Meat is divided into cuts, the best pieces to be eaten fresh, the remainder to be salted or smoked for preservation. Fat is rendered into lard for cooking and tallow for candles and soap. Hides are scraped and salted to be tanned into leather later. Bones are saved for making soup stock or tools. Even intestines are cleaned and used as casings for sausages. Agnes, the carpenter's wife, is particularly skilled at making sausages. She mixes ground pork with salt, herbs, and breadcrumbs, then stuffs the mixture into cleaned intestines, tying them off at intervals. The sausages are hung in the chimney to be smoked slowly over the hearth fire. They will keep for months and provide valuable protein through the winter. The work of autumn is tiring but satisfying. Each completed task, each root cellar filled, each barrel of salt pork packed, each load of firewood stacked, represents security against winter's privations. The villagers know that their survival depends on this careful preparation. A family that enters winter without adequate stores may not survive until spring. The weather itself seems to encourage this industrious mood. The days are often beautiful in autumn, cool and crisp, with brilliant blue skies. The slanting sunlight gives everything a golden glow. But there's an urgency in the air. Everyone can feel winter approaching, even on the loveliest days. The geese are flying south in long V formations. Squirrels are frantically gathering and hiding nuts. Morning frost becomes more common, whitening the grass and making it crunch underfoot. As the season progresses, the village begins to turn inward. Fields that were full of workers all summer are now empty, except for gleaning children, picking through the stubble for any overlooked grains. The great common pasture where animals graze through summer is now dotted with livestock that will be moved to winter shelters soon. The stream that turned the mill wheel so vigorously in spring now runs lower and slower. Evening comes earlier each day. Families gather around their hearths as darkness falls, talking quietly while someone spins wool or mends clothes by firelight. These long evenings will grow longer still as winter approaches. But for now, there is satisfaction in a season's work completed. In full storerooms and ready homes, on the 29th day of September, the village celebrates Michaelmas, the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel. This is one of the quarter days that mark the turning of the year, a time when rents are paid, contracts are renewed, and the agricultural year officially ends. For the villagers, Michaelmas is a welcome break from the hard work of harvest and preparation. It is a time for feasting, for gathering together, for celebrating another year survived. Even though the church calendar includes many feast days throughout the year, Michaelmas holds special significance as the transition point between summer's plenty and winter's scarcity. The day begins, as all days do, with the ringing of the church bell calling the faithful to Mass. The village church of St. Cuthbert is the largest building in Millbrook, built of stone rather than wood, with a square tower visible from miles away. It represents the most ambitious construction project the village has ever undertaken, begun by the grandfathers of the current generation and still not entirely complete. The interior is dim and cool, lit by candles and by light filtering through small windows. Father Benedict, the priest, wears his finest vestments for this feast day, a cope embroidered with images of Saint Michael defeating the dragon. The villagers fill the nave, standing throughout the service, as there are no benches. The poorest stand at the back. The more prosperous villagers occupy positions closer to the altar. The Lord's family, if they choose to attend, have a private chapel where they can observe without mixing with common folk. The Mass is conducted in Latin, which most of the congregation does not understand. But they know the rhythms of the service, when to kneel, when to cross themselves, when to speak the few Latin responses they have learned by rote. Father Benedict's sermon is delivered in the English dialect spoken in this region, and he speaks of Saint Michael's role as protector against evil, as the weigher of souls, as the warrior against darkness. After the service, the villagers gather in the churchyard. The lord of the manor, Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, sits at a table under the oak tree, attended by his steward and his bailiff. One by one, the villagers approach to pay their Michaelmas rents, most pay in kind rather than coin sacks of grain, wheels of cheese, live chickens or geese, bolts of homespun cloth. Each payment is carefully recorded by the steward, who can read and write and keeps meticulous accounts. This rent-paying is solemn business, but it is conducted in a spirit of mutual obligation rather than pure extraction. Sir Geoffrey depends on these rents for his livelihood and his ability to fulfill his own obligations to the king. The villagers depend on Sir Geoffrey for justice, for protection, for the use of the lands they farm. The relationship is ancient and understood, woven into the fabric of society that once the rents are paid, the festive part of the day can begin. Long tables have been set up in the village green. The wealthier families have contributed food for a communal feast. There are roasted geese, for Michaelmas is traditionally the time to eat goose. There are meat pies, breads of various kinds, cheese, butter, honey cakes, and apples. Barrels of ale have been rolled out. Even the poorest families will eat well today, that the feast is rowdy and joyful. Children run about playing games, hoodman's blind, a kind of tag where one child is blindfolded and tries to catch the others. Men compete in friendly contests of strength and skill. Wrestling, archery, quarterstaff fighting. Women cluster in groups, talking and laughing, watching their children and commenting on the competitions. As the afternoon wears on and the ale flows freely, a traveling minstrel who arrived in the village this morning begins to play. He has a small harp and a surprisingly pleasant voice. He sings songs that everyone knows, ballads of Robin Hood, tales of knights and ladies, humorous songs about foolish husbands and clever wives. The villagers join in the choruses, clapping and stamping their feet. Young Edmund, the carter's son, finally works up courage to ask Rose, the swineherd's daughter, to dance. She blushes and accepts. They join other couples dancing in the traditional rounds, simple dances where partners hold hands and move in circles, advancing and retreating in patterns that everyone has known since childhood. The dancing is energetic rather than graceful, but no one cares. This is a day for joy, not refinement. As evening approaches, the feast gradually winds down. Children are carried home by their parents, having eaten too much and played too hard. Adults linger a bit longer, reluctant to let go of this rare day of leisure. The minstrel plays softer songs now, melancholy tunes about love and loss, about the passage of time and the turning of seasons. Sir Geoffrey stands and makes a brief speech, thanking his tenants for their faithful service and wishing them a prosperous year ahead. Then he and his household depart for the manor house, leaving the villagers to their own celebrations. As darkness settles over Millbrook, small groups drift toward their homes, carrying sleeping children, calling goodbyes to neighbors. The village green slowly empties. A few men remain to clear away the tables and barrels, working by torchlight. The minstrel is given a meal and a place to sleep in the church porch, as is customary for travelers. Thomas the baker walks home with his family, his belly full, his heart content. William the apprentice carries Thomas's youngest child on his shoulders. They move slowly through the familiar lanes, past cottages where candlelight glimmers through cracks and shutters, past gardens settling into autumn dormancy, past the mill where the water wheel continues its eternal turning. This has been a good day, Thomas reflects. A day of rest and celebration, of community and abundance. Tomorrow the ordinary work will resume: bread to bake, grain to grind, fields to tend. But today was set apart, a golden moment in the steady flow of time. These are the days that people will remember when winter grows cold and dark, when they tell stories to children gathered around the hearth. The Michaelmas feast will be spoken of in years to come. Who danced with whom? Who ate too much goose and felt ill? Who won the archery contest? What songs the minstrel sang? Memory transforms these ordinary moments into treasures, polishing them until they shine with a light they perhaps did not possess at the time. But that is the gift of community and tradition. They create meaning from the simple fact of people gathering together, sharing food and laughter, marking the passage of time with rituals as old as the village itself. In a cottage at the edge of the village, Margaret the weaver sits at her loom as autumn rain patters on the thatch roof above. The cottage is filled with the tools of her trade. Baskets of wool in various stages of preparation. Spindles and spinning wheels, the great wooden loom that dominates one end of the room. And everywhere the smell of lanolin and damp wool. Margaret is a widow of perhaps 50 years. Though like most villagers, she does not know her exact age. Her husband was a weaver before her, and she learned the craft by watching him work. When he died 7 years ago, kicked in the head by a startled horse, Margaret took over the business. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Widows were sometimes allowed to continue their husbands' trades, though they faced skepticism and occasional hostility from male craftsmen, who felt women should not compete with them. But Margaret's work speaks for itself. The cloth she produces is tight and even, with no thin spots or irregularities. Her patterns are traditional, but executed with skill. The wealthy families in the manor house and in the nearby town seek out her work. So she has been permitted to continue, paying her dues to the Weavers' Guild and maintaining her small cottage and workshop. Today, she is weaving a length of woolen cloth for the priest's new robe. The wool has come from the manor sheep, sheared last spring, cleaned and carded and spun into yarn by various village women over the summer months. The yarn itself tells a story, the work of many hands, each contributing a small part to the finished product. The loom is a large wooden frame that occupies most of the cottage's main room. Vertical threads, called the warp, stretch from top to bottom, held taut by stone weights. Margaret works the horizontal threads, the weft, passing them over and under the warp. Threads in patterns that create the cloth structure and design. The work requires concentration and physical effort. Margaret operates foot pedals that raise and lower different sets of warp threads, creating spaces through which she passes a wooden shuttle carrying the weft thread. After each pass, she uses a heavy wooden beater to push the new thread tightly against the previous ones. The rhythm is steady and somewhat hypnotic. Step on the pedal. Throw the shuttle through the space. Catch it on the other side. Beat the thread tight. Step on the other pedal. Throw the shuttle back. The sound of the loom is distinctive, the thunk of the pedals. The whisper of the shuttle flying through the warp. The solid thud of the beater packing the threads together. Margaret has lived with this sound for so many years that she barely notices it. But to a visitor, it would seem like the cottage itself has a heartbeat. Her granddaughter, young Emma, sits nearby, learning to spin wool into thread. Emma is 9 years old, living with her grandmother since her own mother died in childbirth 2 years ago. The girl's fingers are becoming skilled at drawing out the wool fibers, adding just enough twist to make them hold together as thread. The work is delicate and requires patience, but Emma is a quick learner. "Why does the thread break sometimes, grandmother?" Emma asks as her spindle tumbles to the floor for the third time this morning. Margaret pauses in her weaving to examine the girl's work. Too much twist makes it brittle and tight. Too little, and it has no strength. You must find the balance. Feel the thread as you spin. It will tell you when it is right. This is how knowledge passes from one generation to the next, not through written instructions or formal lessons, but through demonstration and practice, through feeling and intuition developed over time. Emma will probably become a spinner or weaver herself someday, teaching her own daughters and granddaughters the skills Margaret teaches her now. The rain continues through the morning, steady and gentle. It is good weather for indoor work. Margaret is content at her loom, creating something useful and beautiful from simple materials and patient labor. The cloth gradually grows, inch by inch, as the morning passes. Around midday, Alice from the oak tree strips comes to visit, bringing a basket of apples and some fresh bread. The two women have been friends for many years. They sit together by the small hearth fire, talking quietly while Emma continues practicing her spinning. Alice has brought wool that needs to be woven into cloth for her family's winter clothing. She and Margaret negotiate the terms, Alice will provide wool and pay with cheese and a young chicken. Margaret will weave the cloth, keeping a small portion of the wool as her fee. They seal the agreement with a handshake, as their mothers and grandmothers did before them. The conversation drifts to village news. Alice's youngest daughter has been promised in marriage to a young man from the next village. The betrothal will be announced soon, and the wedding will take place after harvest next year. This is cause for both joy and melancholy. Joy at a good match made, melancholy at the thought of the daughter leaving home. Margaret understands. She remembers when her own daughter married and moved to her husband's village, 2 days' walk away. She sees her rarely now, perhaps twice a year when travel is possible. This is the way of things. Daughters grow up and leave. The cycle continues, but Emma will stay. Margaret thinks, watching her granddaughter frowning in concentration over her spindle. Emma will learn the craft and carry it forward. This gives Margaret satisfaction. Her work will continue after she is gone, in the hands of this serious young girl who's already showing talent for the trade. The afternoon passes peacefully. Alice returns home to her own work. Margaret goes back to her loom. Emma, having filled 2 spindles with reasonably good thread, is sent to fetch water from the well and check on the chickens in their coop behind the cottage. By the time evening comes and the light begins to fail, Margaret has completed nearly half a yard of cloth. It is good work, even and strong. Father Benedict will be pleased with his new robe. Margaret covers the loom with a length of old fabric to protect it from dust and smoke, thanks the fire for the night, and calls Emma in from her play. They eat a simple supper of bread, cheese, and onion soup. Then, as darkness settles fully over the village, they sit by the hearth while Margaret tells Emma tales of saints and miracles. Stories of the old times before the village existed, legends of King Arthur and his knights. Emma listens wide-eyed, asking questions, begging for just one more story before bed. Finally, Margaret declares it is time for sleep. They climb the ladder to the sleeping loft, where straw mattresses covered with wool blankets await. Through the thatch roof, they can hear the rain still falling, gentle and steady. It is a comforting sound, like the breathing of the earth itself. Tomorrow, Margaret will return to her loom. The cloth will grow longer, thread by thread, until it is complete. Emma will practice her spinning, her fingers growing more skilled each day. The seasons will continue their turning. The rain will nourish the earth, preparing it for the next planting. And in a small cottage at the edge of Millbrook, the ancient craft of weaving will continue, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from past to future, connecting the generations in an unbroken thread. The smithy stands at the eastern edge of the village, positioned downwind so that its smoke and noise disturb as few people as possible. It is a substantial building, open on one side to allow heat to escape, with a stone forge at its center and tools hanging from every available surface. The floor is hard-packed earth, darkened by years of coal dust and metal filings. Peter the blacksmith is a large man, made powerful by years of working iron. His arms are thick with muscle, his hands scarred and calloused. His leather apron is burned in dozens of places where hot metal has touched it. His face is perpetually smudged with soot, giving him a somewhat fearsome appearance that belies his gentle nature. This morning, Peter is repairing tools for the autumn work. A plow blade has been damaged, hitting a stone hidden in the soil. Several sickles have been dulled by harvest work and need to be resharpened. A hinge from the church door has broken and must be mended. The work is varied and constant. A village this size keeps a blacksmith busy from dawn to dusk. The forge is the heart of the smithy. It is a deep stone basin filled with coal, with bellows to force air through the coals and increase the heat. When Peter pumps the bellows, the coals glow bright orange, then yellow, then white at the hottest point. The heat is intense standing close to the forge. One can feel it pressing against exposed skin like a physical force. Peter's apprentice, a sturdy young man named Hugh, tends the bellows this morning while Peter works on the plow blade. The blade must be heated until it glows red, then hammered on the anvil to reshape the damaged edge, then reheated and hammered again, gradually working the metal back into its proper form. The process requires strength, skill, and patience. The sound of hammer on anvil rings across the village as steady, rhythmic clanging that speaks of work and progress. Each strike is deliberate and purposeful. Peter can judge by the sound and feel whether he is hitting the right spot, whether the metal is at the right temperature, whether the shape is forming correctly. This knowledge has been built over 20 years of daily practice. Beginning when Peter himself was an apprentice learning the trade, between hammer blows, Peter plunges the hot metal into a water trough, creating explosive hisses of steam. This quenching hardens the metal, making it strong enough to withstand the stress of plowing rocky soil. The blade goes from glowing orange to dull gray as the water cools it. Steam rises in clouds, filling the smithy with moisture and the sharp smell of hot metal. As Peter works, villagers come and go with requests and items needing repair. John of the Oak brings the damaged plow blade and stays to watch Peter work, discussing when it will be ready and what payment is expected. Richard the carpenter needs new iron fittings for the church chest he is building. The Lord's steward arrives with a horse that needs new shoes, a task that Peter will attend to this afternoon. The relationship between blacksmith and village is one of mutual dependence. Peter relies on the villagers for food. He cannot farm while working the forge. The villagers rely on Peter for the iron tools and equipment without which farming would be nearly impossible. Plows, hoes, sickles, scythes, axes, hammers, nails, hinges, locks, all these essential items come from the smithy. Iron itself is precious and expensive. Most of it comes from distant forges where iron ore is smelted. Peter purchases iron in bars or ingots from traveling merchants, paying high prices. This is why broken tools are always repaired rather than replaced. The iron they contain is too valuable to waste. Peter has become expert at reworking old iron, reforging it into new shapes. Adding small amounts of new metal when necessary. By midday, Peter has completed the plow blade, sharpened 3 sickles, and begun work on the church hinge. The forge fire has been burning steadily for hours, and the smithy is incredibly hot, despite the cool autumn air outside. Peter and Hugh are both soaked with sweat, their faces red from heat and exertion. They take a break for the midday meal, sitting outside the smithy where a breeze offers some relief. Peter's wife, Joan, brings them bread, cheese, and cold ale. She is a practical woman who manages the household and their small garden plot while Peter works. They have 3 young children who play in the yard, carefully supervised to keep them away from the dangerous forge. After the meal, Peter turns his attention to shoeing the Lord's horse. This is delicate work requiring both strength and sensitivity. The horse must be calmed and reassured. Its hoof must be cleaned and prepared. The old shoe, if present, must be removed carefully. The new shoe must be shaped to fit exactly, then nailed in place without injuring the sensitive parts of the hoof. Peter has shoed hundreds of horses over the years, but he treats each one as an individual. This particular horse is a young gelding, somewhat nervous about the process. Peter speaks to it in a low, soothing voice while Hugh holds its halter. With patient movements, Peter lifts each hoof in turn, examining it, trimming away excess growth with specialized knives, then fitting and nailing the iron shoes. The work takes nearly 2 hours. When it is complete, the horse stands with new shoes all around, ready to carry its rider safely over the autumn roads. The steward pays Peter with silver pennies, actual coin rather than barter, because the lord of the manor has access to money in ways that common villagers do not. Peter wraps the coins carefully in a scrap of cloth and tucks them into a hidden spot in the smithy. He will use them to purchase iron and coal from the next traveling merchant who passes through Dod as afternoon shadows lengthen. Peter returns to the church hinge. This piece requires not just strength but artistic skill. The hinge must be both strong and attractive, suitable for the church door. Peter shapes decorative scrollwork at the hinge's ends, heating and bending the iron into graceful curves. It is painstaking work, requiring many heatings and adjustments. Hugh watches closely, learning. Someday, perhaps 5 or 6 years from now, Hugh will complete his apprenticeship and become a journeyman smith. He might travel to other villages, learning from different masters, before eventually settling somewhere to establish his own smithy. Or he might remain here in Millbrook if Peter chooses to take him as a partner. Either way, he must learn not just the basic skills of the trade, but also the artistic refinements that distinguish a master craftsman from a mere metalworker. By the time the sun touches the western horizon, Peter has completed the hinge. He holds it up to examine in the fading light, checking every curve and angle. It is good, work strong, well-proportioned, attractive. Father Benedict will be pleased. Peter banks the forge fire, covering it with ash so that coals will remain alive until morning, saving the effort of starting a new fire. He and Hugh clean the workspace, returning tools to their proper places, sweeping metal filings into a corner where they can be collected and eventually remelted. The smithy must be kept orderly, for a misplaced tool or tripping hazard can cause serious injury in this dangerous environment. As twilight deepens, Peter washes his face and hands in the water trough, scrubbing away the worst of the soot and grime. It will never be truly clean. The coal dust works its way into every crease and under every fingernail, but he makes himself presentable enough to enter his own home without leaving black marks on everything he touches. John has supper waiting. A thick stew of vegetables with small pieces of pork, bread, and ale. The family gathers around the table in the fading light. Peter says grace, thanking God for the day's work and the food before them. The children chatter about their day's activities. Hugh eats quietly, tired from the day's labor. After supper, Peter sits by the hearth fire, which seems almost cool after the intense heat of the forge. His youngest daughter climbs into his lap, and he tells her a story about the old times when giants supposedly walked the earth and magic was more common. The story is one his own father told him when he was a boy. Perhaps someday this child will tell it to her own children, carrying forward this small piece of family tradition. The day ends peacefully. The forge fire glows under its blanket of ash, waiting for tomorrow. The tools hang in their places, ready for the next day's work. In the distance, the church bell rings for Compline, the final prayer of the day. Peter listens to it and thinks about the hinge he made, which will soon hang on that church door, serving the community for years or perhaps decades to come. This is the satisfaction of the smith's craft. Creating things that last, things that serve essential purposes, things that make the work of others possible. Without iron tools, the village could not survive. Peter knows this, and it gives meaning to his daily labor. He is not merely working metal. He is helping to sustain a community, to maintain the delicate balance between human need and the earth's resources. Beyond the last cottages of the village, where cultivated land begins to give way to forest, there is an apple orchard. It is not large, perhaps 40 trees arranged in rough rows, but it is ancient. Some of the trees were already old when the grandfathers of the current generation were children. Their trunks are gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching in complicated patterns toward the sky. The orchard belongs, technically, to the lord of the manor, but it has always been understood that the villagers may gather the fallen fruit and glean what remains after the lord's household has taken its share. This arrangement benefits everyone. The manor gets first choice of the best fruit. The villagers get the remainder. And the elderly trees continue to be cared for, pruned and tended by people who understand their value. On this October afternoon, several village women and their children are in the orchard, gathering the last of the season's apples. The harvest has been good this year. The trees are heavy with fruit, some already fallen to the ground, some still clinging to high branches. Among the gatherers is Agnes, the carpenter's wife, accompanied by her 2 daughters. They carry woven baskets and work methodically through the orchard, picking up wind-fallen apples, examining each one. Fruit that is sound goes into one basket, to be stored carefully or made into preserves. Fruit that is bruised or partially spoiled goes into another basket, to be fed to pigs or made into cider immediately before it spoils further. The afternoon is cool and pleasant. Golden leaves drift down from the apple trees, carpeting the ground. The air is filled with the sweet fermented smell of apples beginning to decay. Wasps buzz drunkenly around the fallen fruit, gorging themselves on the fermenting sugars. The women work carefully to avoid disturbing them. Young children run through the orchard, playing games among the ancient trees. An older boy climbs into one of the trees, reaching branches that are too high for the adults on the ground. He carefully picks apples and drops them down to his mother, who catches them in her apron. It is a scene that has been repeated every autumn for as long as anyone can remember. Part of the village's seasonal rhythm. Agnes finds a particularly fine apple large, red, unblemished, and bites into it. The flesh is crisp and sweet, with just enough tartness to be interesting. This is one of the pleasures of the harvest season, eating fresh fruit after a summer of anticipation. By late winter, the stored apples will have become soft and wrinkled, but now, in autumn, they are perfect. The women talk as they work, their conversation ranging over many subjects. Rose, the swineherd's daughter, is expecting a child, her first. The weather has been good for the most part, though more rain would be welcome before winter sets in. The priest has announced that a pardoner will visit next month, selling indulgences that promise reduced time in purgatory. Some women are suspicious of pardoners, having heard stories of fraudulent ones, but others are tempted by the promise of spiritual benefit. As the afternoon wears on, the baskets fill. When they are full, the women carry them back to the village, taking turns when the baskets become too heavy. They will return tomorrow if time allows, gathering more fruit until the orchard is fully gleaned. Back in her home, Agnes begins the work of processing the apples. Some will be stored whole in a cool, dry place where they may keep until spring if they are checked regularly, and any that begin to spoil are removed. Others will be sliced and dried, threaded on cords, and hung near the hearth where the smoke and heat will preserve them. Still others will be cooked down into a thick paste that can be stored in sealed jars. Her daughters help with this work, though they complain about the tedium of slicing so many apples. Agnes reminds them that these apples will provide sweetness and nutrition through the long winter, months when fresh fruit is only a memory. The girls nod and continue their work, understanding the truth of this even if they wish the task were already complete. As Agnes works, she reflects on the apple trees themselves. Some are so old that they must have been planted by the village's founders, whenever that was. No one knows exactly how old Millbrook is. There are stories of ancestors settling here generations ago, but the details have been lost. The apple trees stand as living witnesses to that history, producing fruit year after year, decade after decade. She wonders if any of these trees will still be bearing fruit when her daughters have daughters of their own. Some of the oldest trees are clearly declining, producing less fruit each year, their branches becoming more brittle. Eventually, they will die, and new trees will need to be planted to replace them. But apple trees take years to mature and begin bearing fruit. There must always be young trees growing up to replace the old, or the orchard will eventually disappear. This thought makes Agnes sad in a vague, indefinable way. So much of life is about this cycle of growth and decline, youth replacing age, new generations taking the place of old ones. She has seen it in her own family. Her father died 2 years ago. Her children are growing up, and someday she too will be old and then gone. But the work continues. The orchard continues. The village continues. As evening approaches, Agnes has processed most of the day's apple harvest. Sliced fruit hangs drying near the hearth. Whole apples are arranged carefully in a basket in the coolest corner of the house. A pot of apple paste simmers over the fire, filling the house with sweet fragrance. The youngest children have been caught sneaking tastes and gently scolded. Richard comes home from his workshop, tired but content. The family eats supper together, and the conversation turns to plans for tomorrow. More apples need to be gathered. The winter wood supply needs to be checked. A neighbor has asked Richard to repair a broken chest. Life is full of these small, necessary tasks, each one a thread in the larger fabric of village existence. After supper, in the quiet time before sleep, Agnes sits by the hearth and thinks about the orchard. The ancient trees, the cycles of seasons and generations. There is something comforting in the continuity of it all. Her grandmothers gathered apples from those same trees. Her daughters will gather apples there. And perhaps, generations from now, women whose names she will never know will gather apples under trees that haven't yet been planted. Carrying on traditions that feel as eternal as the turning of the earth itself. November brings the first hard frost to Millbrook. The villagers wake one morning to find the world transformed, every blade of grass rimmed with white crystals, every puddle frozen solid, every breath visible in the cold air. The change is not unexpected. They have been preparing for winter for weeks, but still, it feels sudden. A clear marker that summer's warmth is now firmly in the past. Thomas the baker rises in the dark as always. But this morning, he must break ice on the water bucket before he can wet his hands to work the dough. The bakehouse is cold until he coaxes the embers into flame and adds wood to the oven. His breath steams in the air. He works quickly, his fingers stiff with cold, knowing that the warmth of the oven will soon make the workspace comfortable. William the apprentice arrives later than usual, having overslept in the warm cocoon of his blankets. Thomas gives him a mild rebuke but understands. These dark mornings make rising difficult. Soon it will be harder still, when true winter cold settles in and darkness lasts even longer. Across the village, similar scenes unfold. People emerge reluctantly from their homes, wrapped in extra layers of clothing, bracing themselves against the cold. The village well has a crust of ice that must be broken before water can be drawn. Chickens huddle miserably in their coops, their breath rising in small clouds. Cattle stand in their winter shelter, steam rising from their backs. Their feed already supplemented with the precious hay that was stored through summer. Jeffrey, the miller, finds that the stream is running sluggishly this morning, thick with chunks of ice along its edges. The water wheel continues to turn, but more slowly. He worries about the day when the stream might freeze completely, stopping the wheel and making milling impossible. It has happened before in particularly harsh winters. When that occurs, grain must be ground by hand back-breaking work that can only produce small quantities. He makes a mental note to check his supply of flour, ensuring there is enough stored to last through any period when the mill cannot operate. In the fields beyond the village, the landscape has taken on the muted colors of late autumn. The stubble left from harvest is brown and lifeless. The few remaining leaves on the trees are dull yellow or rust-colored, many falling with each gust of wind. The hedgerows are bare, except for the evergreen holly and ivy. Birds are scarce. The summer migrants have long since departed for warmer lands. And even the resident species are quieter, conserving energy against the cold. The villagers' work shifts to reflect the changing season. Outdoor work becomes less central. Fields require little attention now. Animals are confined to their winter shelters. The focus moves to indoor tasks and preparations. Men spend more time repairing tools, making wooden items that might be sold or traded, weaving baskets from willow branches cut earlier in the year. Women spin, weave, sew, and mend, creating the clothing and household goods that will be needed through the long months ahead. Peter the blacksmith finds his work changing too. Fewer agricultural tools need repair now that the fields lie dormant. Instead, he receives requests for household items, iron cooking hooks to hang pots over fires, new hinges for shutters that must be kept tightly closed against winter winds, repairs to the iron bands that hold wooden buckets together. He also makes nails when he has spare time, heating and hammering small pieces of iron into the shape of nails, which are valuable trade goods. The first frost also signals the beginning of slaughter time in earnest. Animals that will not be kept through winter must be killed now before they lose condition. The meat must be preserved quickly salted, smoked, or occasionally frozen if the weather remains cold enough. This work occupies several days and involves most of the village in some capacity. Alice and her family slaughter their pig on a cold, clear morning. It is an event they have been preparing for, both practically and emotionally. The pig has been part of their household since spring, growing fat on kitchen scraps and forage. Now it will become food to sustain them through winter. There is no sentimentality about this. It is simply necessity, but neither is their callousness. The killing is done quickly and humanely by men who know their work. Nothing is wasted. The meat is divided into cuts and packed in salt. The fat is rendered into lard, which will be used for cooking and making soap. The blood is collected and mixed with oats to make blood pudding. Even the intestines are cleaned and used as sausage casings. The head becomes head cheese. The bones will be boiled for stock or given to dogs. The bristles are saved for making brushes. This pattern repeats across the village as families slaughter their animals. The work is hard and sometimes unpleasant, but it is essential. These preserved meats represent survival through the winter months when fresh food becomes scarce. As the days pass and November progresses, the cold deepens. Morning frosts give way to days that never truly warm up. The sun rises late and sets early, giving little heat even at midday. People begin to measure time by the church services more than by the sun, for daylight is now so brief and gray that it provides little guidance. Father Benedict notes the change in his parishioners. They come to church more regularly now, seeking warmth and community as much as spiritual sustenance. The stone church holds cold rather than warmth, but it is larger than most homes. And there is something comforting about gathering together, sharing space and breath, being part of a community facing winter as a collective rather than as isolated families. The evening gatherings around hearth fires become longer and more central to village life. Families cluster close to the fire, doing handwork by its flickering light, spinning, carving, mending. Stories are told and retold. Riddles are posed. Simple songs are sung. Children learn the traditional tales and songs of their people, absorbing the oral culture that has been passed down through generations. Margaret the weaver finds that her cottage becomes a gathering place on some evenings. Other women come to spin or card wool, working together and sharing conversation. These gatherings serve multiple purposes. The work gets done more quickly when people work together. The shared warmth of multiple bodies makes the cottage more comfortable. And the social contact helps alleviate the isolation that winter can bring. Young Emma loves these evenings. She listens to the women's talk, learning about the village's history and relationships, absorbing the complex web of connections that bind the community together. She also improves her spinning skills, for there are several expert spinners who offer advice and demonstrate techniques. The evenings pass quickly, marked by comfortable routine, work and talk, and occasional laughter, punctuated by the crackle of the hearth fire dot as November draws toward its close. The villagers have settled into the rhythms of the cold season. They have made their preparations. The stores are as full as they will be. The animals are sheltered. The homes are banked and shuttered against wind. Now there is nothing to do but endure, to conserve resources, to pass the dark days with patience and hope for spring's eventual return. But there is also a kind of peace in this season. The frantic work of summer harvest has ended. The constant labor in the fields has ceased. While winter brings its own tasks and hardships, it also brings a slower pace, more time for rest and reflection, for strengthening the bonds of family and community that will help everyone survive until the world turns green again. On the last day of November, the village celebrates the feast of St. Andrew. This is not one of the great festivals of the church year, but it marks an important transition point, the beginning of Advent, the season of preparation for Christmas. It is also, according to tradition, a time when young women might perform divinations to learn the identity of their future husbands. Though the church officially frowns upon such practices, the day begins, as always, with Mass. The church is fuller than usual, despite the early hour and the cold. People come bundled in their warmest clothing, breath steaming in the frigid air. The church interior is dark and cold, lit only by candles at the altar. Father Benedict's breath is visible as he chants the Latin prayers. After the service, there is modest celebration, nothing like the abundance of Michaelmas. For winter stores must be conserved, but enough the occasion. Some families have saved special foods for this day: honey cakes, preserved fruits, perhaps a small amount of spiced wine that has been carefully hoarded in the evening. Despite the church's disapproval, several young unmarried women gather secretly to perform traditional divinations. Rose, the swineherd's daughter, now visibly pregnant and married to Edmund, participates as a guide rather than a seeker, having already found her match. But several younger girls are there, giggling nervously as they perform the old rituals. One divination involves peeling an apple in a single continuous spiral, then throwing the peel over the left shoulder. The shape it makes when it lands is supposed to form the initial of the future husband's name. Another involves walking backward around the church 3 times at midnight, then looking into a mirror by candlelight, where the husband's face will supposedly appear. Most of the girls are too frightened to actually attempt this one. Despite their curiosity, these practices are remnants of older beliefs, predating Christianity, woven into the fabric of village life despite official disapproval. The church teaches that the future is in God's hands and should not be sought through divination. But the young women see no harm in these playful rituals, which seem more like games than serious magic. As the feast day ends and November gives way to December, the village settles into the deepest part of winter. The days are at their shortest now. Darkness dominates. Cold settles in like a resident rather than a visitor. The work of staying warm and fed becomes the primary occupation. Yet even in this dark season, there is hope. Advent has begun, promising the celebration of Christmas in a few weeks. The promise of spring exists, though it is distant and abstract. Life continues in its patterns, carrying the villagers forward through time, through seasons, through the endless cycle of birth and death, planting and harvest. Work and rest. December settles over Millbrook like a heavy blanket. The days are brief and gray, the nights long and cold. Snow falls occasionally, transforming the village into a quieter, muffled version of itself. Smoke raises from every chimney in thin streams, visible signs of the fires that are now the centers of household life. The work of winter is different from other seasons, slower, more interior, focused on maintenance and preparation rather than production. Thomas the baker finds that his customers buy less bread now, stretching their flour supplies to last through the long months ahead. William the apprentice is learning to bake the simpler, coarser breads that will sustain the village when resources are scarce. Geoffrey, the miller, watches his store of flour with careful attention, calculating how long it will last if the stream freezes and the mill cannot operate. He has been rationing carefully, but there is always uncertainty in winter. A frozen mill could mean hardship for the entire village. Eleanor helps her father with the lighter tasks, cleaning grain, recording tallies in his simple notation system, keeping the mill cottage tidy. She has grown skilled at reading the sounds of the mill, knowing when the wheel is turning smoothly and when something sounds amiss. This knowledge will serve her well if she someday marries a miller, as seems likely. In the fields, the land rests under its blanket of frost and occasional snow. The strips that were worked so intensively through spring, summer, and autumn now lie dormant, gathering strength for next year's planting. This fallow time is essential. The soil needs rest, just as people do. The medieval farmers understand this instinctively, even if they cannot explain the science of crop rotation and soil depletion. Richard the carpenter works mainly indoors now. His workshop closed on 3 sides against the wind, a brazier providing modest heat. He's crafting smaller items, bowls, spoons, simple furniture that require less space and can be completed more quickly. The church chest stands finished in the corner, ready for delivery once the weather permits Father Benedict to collect it. Martin the apprentice is learning to work by the limited light of winter afternoons, developing the patience that the craft requires. Richard teaches him that winter is a good time for detail work, for projects that need careful attention rather than speed. Summer is for bold work, he tells the boy. Winter is for refinement. Margaret the weaver finds her cottage busier than ever. The women of the village need occupation through the long, dark evenings, and spinning and weaving provide it. Her loom is almost never silent during daylight hours. Emma has become proficient at spinning, producing thread that is nearly as even and strong as her grandmother's. The girl takes pride in this accomplishment, understanding that she is mastering a skill that will serve her throughout her life. Peter the blacksmith works shorter hours now, for coal is precious and must be conserved. He takes on only essential work repairs, but cannot wait until spring, items needed for winter survival. The smithy is one of the warmest places in the village when the forge is lit, and neighbors sometimes find excuses to stop by, warming themselves by the fire while discussing some tool that might need repair. The village exists in a state of suspension. During these deep winter weeks, people venture out only when necessary, conserving energy and warmth. The paths between houses are worn into the snow by repeated footsteps, but the outlying areas remain pristine and white. The forest is silent except for the occasional call of a crow or the rustle of wind through bare branches. Food becomes simpler and more monotonous. Fresh vegetables are long gone. Dried and preserved foods make up most meals. Salted meat, dried fish, root vegetables from storage, bread, cheese, and the inevitable pottage that simmers over every hearth. People begin to crave the green foods of spring, though that season is still months away. Yet there is anticipation too. Christmas is approaching, bringing with it the promise of feasting, celebration, and respite from winter's grinding routine. The church teaches that this is a season of waiting and preparation, and the villagers embrace this rhythm. Advent becomes a time of reflection, of simplification, of focusing on what truly matters: faith, family, community, and the hope of renewal. Father Benedict uses his sermons to remind his flock of the spiritual dimensions of this season. The darkness of winter mirrors the darkness of a world waiting for Christ's birth. The cold and hardship people endure now reflect suffering from which Christ came to redeem humanity. The coming feast represents not just earthly celebration, but the light of salvation entering a dark world. These messages resonate with people who live so close to the rhythms of nature. They understand darkness and light, cold and warmth, scarcity and plenty. The church's calendar aligns with their lived experience, making the spiritual teachings feel immediate and real. As Christmas draws near, preparations begin despite the scarcity of winter. Special foods are set aside for the feast. The church is cleaned and decorated with evergreen branches, holly, ivy, and pine boughs that remain green even in winter's depths, symbolizing eternal life. Children practice songs they will sing during the Christmas services. On Christmas Eve, the entire village gathers in the church for midnight mass. The building is crowded with bodies, making it warmer than usual. Candles illuminate the space, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Father Benedict wears his finest vestments. The service is longer and more elaborate than usual, filled with special prayers and songs. Despite the Latin words that most cannot understand, there is power in the ceremony. The community has come together to mark this most sacred night, to celebrate the mystery of divine love entering human form. Rich and poor stand side by side. Grievances are temporarily forgotten. The cold and hardship of winter seem distant, held at bay by candlelight and shared purpose. After the service, people linger in the churchyard despite the cold, exchanging greetings and well wishes. There is a spirit of generosity. Small gifts are given. Long-standing debts are forgiven. Feuds are reconciled. The Lord of the Manor makes an appearance, distributing small loaves of special bread to his tenants. A gesture of noblesse oblige that reinforces the social bonds. Christmas Day itself is a time of feasting and rest. No one works except for the most essential tasks: tending animals, maintaining fires, preparing food. Families eat their saved delicacies, and perhaps a small amount of fresh meat if an animal has been recently slaughtered. There is ale and sometimes weak wine. The mood is festive despite winter's grip. Children receive simple gifts, perhaps a carved wooden toy, a new cap or mittens, a sweet cake. These modest presents bring disproportionate joy, for gifts of any kind are rare luxuries. The children play together in the snow, building snowmen, throwing snowballs, sledding down hills on makeshift sleds made from boards or bark. The Christmas season extends for 12 days, ending with the Feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. These days provide a welcome break from routine, a time when normal rules are slightly relaxed and celebration is permitted even in winter's depths. There are parties, games, and gatherings. The traditional Lord of Misrule is chosen, often a young man from the village who presides over festivities with mock authority, turning social hierarchies temporarily upside down in controlled celebration. But eventually, the celebrations end. The Epiphany passes and ordinary time returns. January stretches ahead, cold and long. The village settles back into winter's patient waiting. Food stores are noticeably depleted now. The remaining supplies must be carefully rationed to last until spring. This is the hardest part of winter, when the novelty of snow has worn off. When Christmas is past and spring is still distant. When cold has penetrated every building and fatigue has settled into every bone. People become irritable, prone to disputes over minor matters. Sickness spreads through the crowded cottages where families huddle together for warmth. Some of the elderly and very young will not survive until spring. Yet life persists. Thomas bakes his bread each morning. Geoffrey's mill wheel turns when the stream is not frozen. Richard carves his wood. Margaret weaves her cloth. Peter maintains his forge. The rhythms of work continue, providing structure and purpose even in the darkest days. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the days begin to lengthen. By late January, observant villagers notice that sunset comes slightly later than it did in December. The change is tiny minutes per day, but it is real. The turning point has been reached. The earth is beginning its slow return toward spring. This knowledge brings hope that sustains the village through February and March, when winter often seems determined to maintain its grip. Snowstorms may come. Cold may intensify. But the villagers know that beneath the frozen ground, seeds are waiting. In the forest, sap is beginning to move in the trees. In the animal pens, livestock is beginning to show signs of spring breeding. The cycle is continuing, as it always has and always will. Epilogue. The circle completes as we near the end of our journey through Millbrook's year. We return to where we began, to the baker's dawn, to the miller's wheel, to the steady rhythms of ordinary life in a medieval village. The winter passes. Spring arrives, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. The fields are plowed and planted. The cycle of growth begins again. Thomas bakes his bread. Geoffrey grinds his grain. Richard shapes his wood. Peter forges his iron. Margaret weaves her cloth. The children grow older. The elderly pass away. New babies are born. The village endures as it has endured for generations, sustained by the patient labor of ordinary people doing ordinary work. There are no dramatic events to record, no great deeds to celebrate. Just the steady turning of seasons, the reliable rhythms of planting and harvest. The comfort of tradition and community. This is the reality of medieval life for most people. Not the castles and knights of legend, but the villages and fields where the vast majority of humanity lived out their lives. They were born, they worked, they raised families, they died, all within a radius of a few miles. Their world was small by our standards, but it was complete. It provided everything they needed to live lives of meaning and dignity. As you drift towards sleep, let yourself be carried by these gentle rhythms. Imagine the sound of the mill wheel turning, the smell of bread baking, the sight of golden grain rippling in summer wind. Let the peace of that simpler time wash over you, bringing rest and tranquility. The medieval world had its hardships, to be sure, but it also had its beauties, the deep satisfaction of work done with the hands. The security of belonging to a community where everyone was known. The comfort of traditions passed down through generations. The rhythm of life aligned with nature's seasons. In Millbrook, the daily round continues. Thomas rises in darkness to bake his bread. Geoffrey tends his mill. The seasons turn. The years pass. And in the steady persistence of ordinary life, there is something profound, a testimony to human resilience, community, and the quiet dignity of work done well. May these peaceful images carry you gently into sleep, into dreams of simpler times and quieter rhythms. May you rest well and wake refreshed. The story ends as it began, with the simple sounds of a village at peace, the turning of the mill wheel, the song of a lark, the whisper of wind through grain, and the eternal rhythm of human life continuing, season after season, year after year, through the ages.